Chapter 1. An Interesting Woman. I first met Penelope Ashton at a dinner party. She was not a beautiful woman, but she was well dressed, quite pretty, and, as I quickly realized, very intelligent. She was a good listener, but did not say much herself. After dinner, I managed to spend a lot of time talking to her. I learned that she was a biologist, doing research with Professor Lumsden at University College in London. She was an attractive and interesting woman. It was late when the party came to an end, and I took her to catch the last train home. "Which station does your train go from?" I asked. "Victoria," she replied. In the taxi on the way to Victoria Station, I asked her out to dinner. She was silent for a moment, then said, "All right, Wednesday evening." After she had hurried off to catch her train, I realized I didn't know if she was married or not. On the following Wednesday, I met her at University College at 7:15 in the evening. "Do you always work so late?" I asked. She shook her head. "Not always. It depends on how my work is going. Sometimes earlier, sometimes later." We went to the theatre and had dinner afterwards in a restaurant in Soho. For me it was a most enjoyable evening, and I think it was for Penelope too. In the next 6 weeks we went out together several times, and I realized that Penelope Ashton was becoming a serious part of my life. One evening we had dinner at my flat. I cooked a Chinese meal for her, and when she told me how much she'd enjoyed the meal, she also invited me to her home for the weekend, to meet her family. Marlow is a small town on the River Thames, about an hour's drive from London. The house where Penelope lived with her father and her sister was in the countryside, just a few minutes from the town. It was a large and beautiful house, the kind that you read about in the best magazines. It had a big, well-kept garden, tennis courts, and a swimming pool. Penelope's father, George Ashton, was in his mid-50s. His wife was dead, and he had not married again. He was tall, grey-haired, and very fit, as I discovered when he beat me at tennis. After the game I was tired, but Ashton dived into the swimming pool for a swim before going back to the house for a shower. He was 25 years older than I was, but I was exhausted from the game of tennis, which I had lost. I sat down beside Penelope. "Is he always like that? Always so full of energy?" I asked. "Always," she promised. Her sister, Gillian, was not at all like Penelope. She was the kind of woman who likes to stay at home and run the house. It was a large house with several servants, and she organized it very well. Gillian told the servants what to do. She planned the meals, and seemed to be very happy. It was a friendly family, and I soon felt very comfortable with them, although I knew that I was there to be inspected. We had dinner, we talked, the girls went to bed, and George Ashton and I sat and talked for a long time. He told me about his 2 factories, which made special kinds of plastic materials. Then he asked me, very politely, how I earned my living. "I'm an economist," I answered. "I work in a company which studies economic problems and then helps other companies to do their business better. We don't work for big companies, but lots of smaller ones, like yours, find our advice useful." Ashton seemed happy with my answers, and the rest of the weekend passed quietly. On Sunday evening, as I was leaving, Ashton invited me to return the following weekend. I was happy to accept. I had enjoyed that first family weekend, and I had enjoyed their company. Ashton, the rich, fit, and independent businessman, Gillian, his home-loving daughter, and Penelope, the scientist with her own career outside the family. The only strange member of the group was Benson, Ashton's personal servant. He spoke with a gentle, educated accent, but his face looked as if he had had far too many fights when he was a young man. Chapter 2. Acid in the Eyes. Penelope was very busy the next week. She worked all Friday night, and when I met her at the laboratory on Saturday morning, she looked very tired. "I'm going to have to sleep this afternoon, Malcolm. It won't be much of a weekend for you, I'm afraid, but I'm sure my father will keep you busy. I'm sorry, but I'm just very, very tired." I was sorry too, because I was going to ask her to marry me that weekend. However, it wasn't the right moment to put the question, so I asked her what she'd been doing all night. "Oh, we were doing a very difficult experiment, trying to transfer some dangerous genetic material." "Is all this useful?" I asked. "Does it do any good, or is that a state secret?" "Oh, no secret, but it's useful all right. What we're doing is an important part of medical research into cancer," she replied. Once again I spent an enjoyable weekend with the Ashtons. We swam, we played tennis, we talked. It sounds boring, but it was, for all of us, an important way to relax from the problems of the working week. On Sunday evening, Gillian went to church, and Penelope, her father, and I sat talking in the garden. It was a beautiful summer evening. Suddenly we heard a scream. Then another. Ashton said sharply, "What the devil was that?" And we all jumped to our feet, just as Gillian came round the corner of the house, holding her hands to her face. She screamed again, and fell to the grass. Ashton was the first to reach her. He tried to pull her hands from her face, but she resisted him with all her strength. Penelope bent over Gillian, who was now lying on the grass. The screams had stopped, and a faint voice murmured, "My eyes! Oh, my eyes!" Penny put her finger to Gillian's face, and then put it to her nose. She turned to her father. "Quick! Take her into the kitchen, quickly!" She turned to me. "Ring for an ambulance. Tell them it's an acid burn." I ran to the telephone as Ashton lifted Gillian up and carried her to the kitchen. I dialed 999, and immediately a voice said, "Emergency services?" "Ambulance." I gave the address and telephone number. "It's a bad acid burn on the face," I said. "We'll be there as quickly as we can," said the voice. I went to the kitchen where Penelope was trying to clean Gillian's face. Gillian was still murmuring low cries of deep pain. I looked at Ashton. I have never seen such an expression of helpless anger on anyone's face. But there was nothing I could do there, so I went outside. Benson was looking at the ground near the gate. "I think someone parked his car here, sir, and waited for Miss Gillian. He must have thrown acid into her face when she walked into the garden. It looks as if he turned the car on the grass then and drove away." I looked at the marks on the grass. "I think you're right," I said. I ran back to the house, dialed 999 again, but this time, when the voice said emergency services, I replied, "Police, please. I want to report a criminal attack." The ambulance arrived very quickly and took Gillian and Penelope to hospital. Ashton followed them in his car, but before he went, I took him to one side. "I've sent for the police. They'll come while you're at the hospital, but don't worry about that. I'll stay here until you come back." He seemed not to understand at first, and looked at me as if he did not even know me. I repeated what I had said, and this time he heard me. "Thanks, Malcolm," he replied. He looked as if he had grown 10 years older in the last 15 minutes. Alone in the house, I poured myself a drink and sat down to think while I waited for the police. Nothing made sense. Gillian Ashton was an ordinary young woman who liked living at home, looking after her father. What possible reason could anyone have for throwing acid in her face? I thought about it for a long time, and got nowhere. After a while, a police car arrived. I could not tell the two policemen much, because I knew very little about Gillian and her father, and they did not seem very satisfied with what I told them. 20 minutes later, another car arrived. A policeman in plain clothes came in. "I'm Detective Inspector Honister," he said. "Are you Mr. Jaggard?" "That's right. Come in, Inspector. I've got something to show you which I'm not supposed to let you see, but in these circumstances I think I have to show it to you." Honister looked puzzled as I gave him my special identity card. "We don't see many of these, Mr. Jaggard. They're rather special. Have you any ideas about what's happened? Are you here on business?" I shook my head. "No, I've got no ideas. I'm not here for professional reasons. I'm just a family guest for the weekend." "Well, this looks like the sort of problem we're going to have to solve the hard way, step by step. But I'll be glad to have your help, Mr. Jaggard." Ashton and Penny came back some hours later. Penny looked pale and tired, but Ashton had recovered some of his energy. "Good of you to stay, Malcolm. Stay a little longer. I want to talk to you. Not now, but later." He spoke as if it was an order, not a request. He went off to his study, and I turned to Penny. "How's Gillian?" "Not good," she said sadly. "It was strong acid. What sort of person could do such a terrible thing?" "That's what the police want to know." "Does your father have any enemies?" I asked. "Daddy?" She frowned. "If you become successful, you're bound to upset some people, so there must be some people who don't like him. But not the kind of enemy who'd throw acid into his daughter's face. That's something different." I had to agree, and we talked as we had our dinner, just the two of us. Shortly afterwards, Benson came into the room. "Mr. Ashton would like to see you, sir," he announced. Ashton was sitting at his desk, a glass of whisky in his hand. The bottle in front of him was half empty. "I'm so sorry about what has happened," I said. "I know, Malcolm," he agreed. "But tell me, how are things with you and Penny?" "We're very good friends. Is that what you mean?" "Not exactly." "What are your plans?" he replied. "I intend to ask her to marry me, but I haven't done so yet." He rubbed the side of his face and thought for a moment. "What about your job? Is the money good?" "It's fairly well paid," I replied, "and I have a private income as well." "What about the future? Will you get promoted?" "I think so. I'm trying hard." He was silent for a few minutes. Then he went on. "I could offer you a better job. You'd start in Australia, you and Penny, but you'd enjoy that. The only trouble is that you'd have to start almost immediately." He was going too fast for me. "Just a minute," I said. "I don't even know if she'll marry me. I haven't asked her yet." "She will," he said positively. "I know my daughter." "Maybe so," I replied, "but I'd like to know a lot more about this job before I decide, and talk about it fully with Penny." Ashton was annoyed, but he tried to hide it. "Well, we can wait a week or two to decide about Australia, but you ought to ask her to marry you now. I can get you a special license, and you could be married by the end of the week." "Stop," I said. "You're going too fast for me. Tonight isn't the right time to ask Penny to marry me, not after what happened to Gillian today." Ashton stood up and walked impatiently around the room. "You're right, of course. It's between you and Penny, and it's wrong of me to interfere. But do ask her to marry you now, this evening." I stood up. "Mr. Ashton, I don't think that would be a good thing to do, especially today. I won't do it now. I'll do it when I think it's right." I left his study immediately. I did not understand why it was suddenly so important for Penny and me to marry so quickly. There was something wrong, and I had no idea what it was. Penelope was telephoning when I entered the hall. "I've been talking to the doctors at the hospital," she said. "They say Gillian's resting more comfortably now." "Good, I'm glad about that. Look, I'll come back tomorrow. Perhaps we can both go to visit her and see how she feels." Chapter 3. The Mysterious George Ashton. When I walked into the office on Monday morning, there was a message on my desk. My boss, Harrison, wanted to see me immediately. "You told a policeman at the weekend who you were," he accused me. "Why? Your job is supposed to be secret." "I was at a house party, and something horrible happened. Acid was thrown in a girl's face. The police were beginning to look at me suspiciously, so I had to tell them who I was. They would have wasted a lot of time on me if I hadn't. We're supposed to cooperate with the police, aren't we?" "Was it really necessary to tell the police about yourself?" he asked. "In my opinion, I had no choice. Damn it, I wanted to help the police." I walked out of his office and went back to my own, feeling very angry. Larry Godwin was there. We shared an office and were good friends. He also knew a great deal about factories and businesses in Britain. "Do you know anything about a man called Ashton?" I asked him. "He runs a factory in Slough. They make a special kind of plastic material." "I haven't heard of him," said Larry. "Why don't you ask Nellie? She knows everything," he laughed. The computer that our office used was called Nellie. I forget why. In its memory there was an enormous amount of information. I sat down in front of the screen, pushed a couple of buttons, and the words "Identify yourself" appeared on the screen. I identified myself, and Nellie asked, "Information level?" I answered, "Green." All the information in the computer was kept on different levels. Some people had permission to look only at information which was not very important and not very secret. That was level green. There was other, very secret information which could only be seen by Ogilvy, the head of the department. In between, there were several different levels, each one known by a colour. I typed in Ashton's name and address, and almost immediately the message came up on Nellie's screen. "This information is not available at this level. Try level yellow." I was very surprised. I hadn't expected to find anything at all about Ashton in the computer memory. What Nellie's message meant was that somewhere in the computer there was a lot of information about George Ashton, and that information was secret. Ashton wasn't just an ordinary businessman. I typed my identification for level yellow. This was more complicated and took me 4 minutes. Back came Nellie's reply. "This information is not available at this level. Try level red." I sat back to think. I knew that information at level red was very secret, and I began to wonder about Ashton. Who was he? Why was everything about him so secret? I had permission to see level red, but it took me 10 minutes to go through the stages to identify myself. Finally, I finished typing and waited for Nellie to tell me all about Penelope's mysterious father. Instead of that, Nellie replied on the screen, "This information is not available at this level. Try level purple." Level purple was too high, too secret for me. All I had learned about George Ashton was that something in his life or work was extremely important and secret. A couple of hours later, Larry and I were talking in our office when the phone rang. It was Harrison, our boss. "What the hell have you been doing with the computer, you fool?" he demanded. "Nothing much. Why? Has it broken down?" I said. "What's all this about a man called Ashton?" he continued. "Ogilvy wants to see both of us immediately. Come on." Ogilvy was the head of our department. He was not alone. There was a short, fat man sitting in one of the chairs. Ogilvy didn't introduce him, but asked me immediately, "Malcolm, why are you so interested in George Ashton?" "I'm going to marry his daughter," I replied. This statement produced a very surprising response. For a minute, everybody stared at me in shocked silence. Then the fat man said, "Why did you think information about Ashton might be in the computer?" "No reason," I replied. "I didn't know anything about him, and someone suggested, just as a joke, that I should look in the computer. I didn't expect to find even his name there. But something strange happened over the weekend, and I wanted to find out more about him." "What happened?" "Someone threw acid into his daughter's face, and—" "The face of the girl you intend to marry?" interrupted the nameless man. "No, the younger girl, Gillian. Later on, Ashton behaved strangely." "I'm not surprised," said Ogilvy. He turned to Mr. Nameless. "Do you think this is serious?" "Could be very serious, but I think we're lucky. We already have an inside man, someone in the family." Mr. Nameless pointed his cigarette at me. "Now wait a minute," I said. "I don't know what this is all about, but Ashton is going to be my father-in-law. I'm going to be a member of his family. You surely aren't going to ask me to spy on him?" "We're not asking you," said Mr. Nameless calmly. "We're telling you what to do." "Forget it. I'm not going to be a spy in my own family." Mr. Nameless looked at me in surprise, then looked at Ogilvy and said, "I thought you said this man was a good member of your department. I don't think I can agree." "I'm not worried about what you think," I replied angrily. "Be quiet, Malcolm," said Ogilvy. He turned to Harrison. "You can go now, Joe." Joe Harrison did not look happy as he left. As the door closed behind him, Ogilvy said, "I think Malcolm has made an important point. An agent, someone working for the department, should not be personally involved in a particular case. Malcolm, what do you think of Ashton?" "I like him. What I know of him. He's not an easy man to get to know, but I've only met him on 2 weekends." "I take your point," said Mr. Nameless, suddenly more friendly. "But we must not waste the fact that Mr. Jaggard is on the inside. That could be very useful to us." Before I could object, Ogilvy said quickly, "I think that Malcolm will investigate what has happened in Ashton's family as soon as he understands clearly why he should do so." "Oh, yes," replied Mr. Nameless, "but you mustn't say too much. You know the problem and its limits." "I think we can keep within the limits," replied Ogilvy coldly. Mr. Nameless stood up. "Then that's what I'll report." When he had gone, Ogilvy said, "Malcolm, you really must be careful about what you say to important officials of the government. You're too rich and independent-minded. You don't care what you say to people. Luckily, I warned his lordship before you came in that you're not an easy person to work with." His lordship? Who, I wondered, was this man? How was he so important? What did he have to do with Ashton? Ogilvy went on, "Take things easy now, Malcolm. Don't make any difficulties that aren't real ones. Will you do that?" "Of course," I replied. "That isn't too much to ask, as long as I know what I'm supposed to do." Ogilvy invited me to have lunch with him so that I could tell him everything that had happened. When I had finished, He lit a cigarette and said, "All right, you're a trained detective. Is there anything unusual about Ashton?" I thought for a moment before replying, "There's a servant called Benson. He seems ordinary, but Ashton doesn't seem to treat him like an ordinary servant." "Okay," said Ogilvy. "Anything else that was unusual?" "The way he asked me to marry Penelope. He was in such a hurry. He behaved almost like an old-fashioned father with a pregnant daughter." "You know what I think," said Ogilvy. "I think Ashton is frightened. Very frightened. Not so much for himself, but for his daughters. One's been attacked, and he seems to think that if he can get Penny away from him, she'll be all right. That's why he suddenly invented that job in Australia for you." "Just a minute. I don't understand this," I said. "Who is this man Ashton? Why are we so bloody interested in him?" "Sorry, I can't tell you that. But I can tell you what you have to do." "What's that?" I asked. "Take good care of the girl. That means also looking after the father, of course." "Without knowing the reason why?" "You know why. You've got to make sure that Penelope Ashton doesn't get acid thrown in her face." "But I'm really guarding Ashton." "Yes, you're right there. And you mustn't let any of them know who you really are, or that you work for this department. That's going to be difficult, I know, but I can give you a team of men to help you." "You mean I have to guard a man and his daughter without telling them that I'm guarding them? I'll certainly need help." "You'll get it," said Ogilvy with a smile. "Doesn't it worry you that you're marrying into such a mysterious family?" "I'm marrying Penelope, not her father," I replied. Chapter 4. Family Problems. Later that afternoon, I drove to Marlow to talk to Inspector Honister. He looked at me curiously and a little unhappily. "One of your people has been on the phone to tell me that I mustn't talk to anyone about you." "There was no need to do that. I'm a policeman, so I know how to keep secrets." I cursed the stupidity of someone in Ogilvy's office who would try to interfere, and said to Honister, "Look, forget all that nonsense. Last night I told you I had nothing official to do with Ashton. It was true then, but it isn't true now. My office now has a definite interest in him. I'm going to need your help." "I'll be happy to give it, as long as you don't try to hide things from me." "What do you want to know?" "First of all, how's the girl?" "We're not allowed to talk to her, so she must be bad," he replied. "Her sister's been at the hospital most of the day." "Have you spoken to Ashton?" I asked. "Yes. He says he can think of no possible reason why anyone should attack his daughter in that way. He told me nothing of any use," replied Honister. "I'll see both of them later," I said, "and I'll try to get more information. I want to catch that man with the acid." "Does Ashton know who and what you are?" asked Honister. "No, he doesn't. And he mustn't find out either," I replied. "That's going to give you an interesting life, with you wanting to marry his daughter, too." I smiled. "Where did you find that information?" "I'm a good policeman. One of the servants in Ashton's house was quite happy to talk about you and Miss Ashton." "All right. Tell me a few secrets about Ashton." "We've got very little. Some time ago, one of our policemen talked to him about safety and how to protect his house against burglars. A waste of time. Ashton's house was already almost as well protected as the Bank of England." That was interesting to know. What did Ashton have that was so valuable? Honister went on, "Don't forget, it wasn't George Ashton who was attacked. It was Gillian Ashton. An acid attack on a woman always makes me wonder about another woman. Could it be a jealous wife getting her revenge on Gillian? I've thought of that too. Penny says it's impossible. Gillian isn't that kind of woman. She may be right, but you never know. It's one of the possibilities I've got to try to find out about, said Honister. Of course, but I don't think it'll lead you to the man who threw the acid. You could be right, he replied. Somehow I don't think we're going to find this man easily. I'm going to talk to Penelope and her father, I said. Shall I meet you later on and tell you what I've learned? Yes, I'd like that. I'll be in the bar of the Coach and Horses between 9 and 10 o'clock. See you then. When I arrived at Ashton's house, the gates were closed, and I had to ask a guard to let me in. Neither Ashton nor Penelope was at home, but Benson told me that Penelope had telephoned to say that she would be home quite soon. This is a very bad business, sir. Very bad. How does Mr. Ashton seem after the attack? I asked him. He's upset, of course, sir. Very upset. But he seems to be taking it very well. He went to his office this morning as usual. Can I get you a drink, sir? It was clear that Benson did not want me to ask him too many questions about Ashton, so I asked him to bring me a whisky. He did so, and left the room. Penelope arrived before I'd finished my drink. She looked very tired and pale. "Oh, Malcolm," she cried, "how good to see you." "How's Gillian?" I asked. "A little better, I think. She's getting over the shock." "I'm very glad to hear it. I talked with Inspector Honister, the policeman in charge of the case. He'd like to talk to Gillian as soon as possible." "Oh, Malcolm, she isn't ready for that yet. It's too soon." She came close to me, and I put my arms around her. "Are her injuries that bad?" I asked. She put her head on my chest for a moment and said, "You don't realize how bad this sort of thing is for a woman. Women care much more about their appearance than men. Gillian's got to get over 2 bad shocks, a psychological shock as well as a physical one." "Yes, I can understand that. But Honister needs to know anything that Gillian can tell him. At the moment, he knows nothing, not even if the attacker was a man or a woman." Penelope looked surprised. "I hadn't thought of that. And Gillian hasn't talked about it. We've kept off the subject of acid throwing." "When you go to the hospital tonight, could you see if she can remember anything at all about what happened? We've got to find this person, and it's probably better if you talk to her than if Honister does it. But he really does need to know what happened. Maybe Gillian can remember something about the acid thrower." "I'll try, but I can't promise that she'll be able to tell me anything useful." Penelope went to get dinner ready, and I walked around in the garden until Ashton came home. He looked worried and tired, but there was more than that. He had the look of a small boy who has just discovered that the world is an unjust place. The look of a boy who has been punished for something he hasn't done. "Gillian's blind," he said shortly. "Oh, no. I'm so sorry," I replied. "Does she know? Does Penny know?" "Neither of them knows, and I don't want them to know until Gillian's strong enough to take the shock. So don't tell Penny." "I won't tell her, but she might find out for herself. Don't forget she's a doctor." "Well," he said, "I'd rather they knew later than sooner. What a terrible thing this is, Malcolm. I just can't understand it." "Don't you have any ideas at all?" I asked. I had to start to do my job as a policeman. I could also see that Ashton was now carrying a gun in a pocket under his arm, but I could hardly ask him about that. Could there be something in Gillian's life that you don't know about? Could she have become involved with some unsuitable friends? He became angry immediately. "Impossible," he said very sharply. "Gillian's always been such a good girl. I've never had any problems with her. She's never done a thing wrong. Penny's different. She can be very difficult at times. You'll find that out if you marry her. But Gillian's never been any trouble at all." When Ashton said this, I understood the pain parents feel when their children are sick or when they get hurt in an accident. Then Ashton asked me if I thought any more about asking Penny to marry me immediately and go to Australia. I told him I hadn't changed my mind, that it was the wrong moment to present Penny with new problems. "I suppose you're right," he said, in a disappointed voice. "Are you staying to dinner, Malcolm?" "With your permission," I replied politely. "I'm taking Penelope to the hospital afterwards." He nodded. "Don't tell her about Gillian's eyes. Promise me that." "I already have." He didn't answer that, but turned on his heel and walked away towards the house. I felt very sorry for him. Whatever the information about him in the computer, I could see in his eyes the deep pain that he was suffering. Penny and I went to the hospital, and I waited for an hour while she talked to Gillian. Then we went to meet Inspector Honister, and I introduced him to Penny. "Thank you for coming, Miss Ashton," he said. "We're doing the best we can in this case, but we need information, and we haven't got any." "I understand," she replied. "I've got some news for you, but I don't know how much it will help you." "Well, Miss Ashton, let's hear what you've got," said Honister gently. "Gillian says it was a man." "Ah," said Honister with satisfaction. A little more than half the population of Britain had just been dropped from his list of possible suspects. "What sort of man? Young? Old? Anything you can tell me will be of value." He led Penelope through Gillian's story several times, and each time managed to get a little more helpful information. Gillian had walked back from church and had seen a car parked near the entrance to the drive leading to the house. Someone was bending over the car, looking at the engine. She thought the car had broken down and went over to offer to help. As she came up to him, the man turned and smiled at her. She had never seen him before. She was just about to speak to him when he threw the acid into her face. He didn't speak at all, but she could remember that he was about 40, with pale skin. She couldn't really say anything more about him. After Honister had left us, Penny and I talked a bit more about what we had learned. Then we fell silent. "What are you thinking about?" asked Penny after a few minutes. Automatically I said what was in my mind. "I'm thinking it would be a good idea if we got married." "Malcolm," she said with surprise, shock, pleasure and sadness, all mixed up in that one word. "Don't you think it's a good idea?" I said, and watched her try to find words to reply. "But don't say, 'This is so sudden.'" "But that's exactly what it is, so sudden," she said. "And here of all places." "Does the place matter?" "I don't suppose it does," she said quietly. "But the time does. Why now?" "I suppose I could have picked a better time," I agreed. "But the question just jumped out of my mouth. You asked me what I was thinking about. Actually, I'm not the only one who thinks it's a good idea. Your father does, too. He wanted me to ask you last night.
So you two have been discussing me behind my back? I don't know that I like that.
Don't get angry. It's traditional and polite for a man to talk about his plans with his probable future father-in-law.
What would you have done if he had been against it? Asked Penelope.
I'd have asked you just the same. I'm marrying you, not your father.
You're not marrying anyone, yet.
She laid her hand on mine.
You idiot. I was beginning to think you'd never ask.
I was going to, but other things got in the way.
I know, she said sadly. I've been so unhappy today, thinking about Gillian and seeing her in so much pain. And Daddy, he doesn't say much, but I think he's going through hell. And now you come and give me more problems.
I'm sorry, Penny. Perhaps I should take the question back. Forget about it for now.
No, she said. You can't unask a question.
She was silent for a while, and at last she said,
I will marry you, Malcolm. I'd marry you tomorrow, but that can't be. I don't know when it will be. We've got to get this business with Gillian sorted out first. Can you wait?
Of course, I replied happily. As we drove to her home, my heart was like a singing bird, and I realized the truth in all that the poets say about love. I think we should tell your father. He seems to be worried about you, I suggested, just before Penny went in.
I'll tell him now, she said, as she gave me a good-night kiss.